how I was made a prisoner in a Boer lager, there Piet, Band is stony cop with is Boer bread and biltong, and is flask of awful dop. Is mauser for amusement and is pony for retreat. I've known a lot o' fellas shoot a damn sight worse than Piet. Kipling. Provisions at Setlagolly and in the surrounding districts were now fast running out, and Mrs. Fraser announced to me one morning she had only full allowance of meal for another week. In that colony no meal meant no bread, and it was, in fact, the most important factor in the housewife's mind when thinking of supplies. While on this subject, I must remark what very excellent bread is that made by the Dutch. No matter how poor or dilapidated the farmhouse is, large loaves of beautiful, slightly browned bread are always in evidence, baked by the mother or daughters. The non-existence of the railway was beginning to cause much distress, Dutch and English suffering alike. In fact, if it had not been for the locusts, unusually numerous that year, and always a favourite food with the natives, these latter would also have been starving. As every mouth to feed was a consideration, I determined to see if I could personally induce the Boer General to pass me into Mafeking. Under Mrs. Fraser's charge I left my maid, as I did not wish to expose her to any hardships in the LAAGER, and to her I gave the custody of my pony Dop, to whom I had become much attached. After detaining me a prisoner, the Boers returned to Setlagolly specially to secure this animal. They had heard the natives speak of her in terms of high appreciation, and describe her as not a horse but lightning. Meatelke, with much spirit, declared the pony to be her property, having been given her, she said, in lieu of wages. She further stated she was a German subject, and that if her horse were not returned in 3 days she should write to the Kaiser. All this was repeated to General Snyman by the awestruck Veldkornet. After a week spent with the Boers, Dop arrived back at Setlagolly, carefully led, as if she were a sacred beast, and bringing a humble letter of apology from the commandant. But I am anticipating, and must return to my solitary drive to the LAAGER, accompanied only by Vellum and another black boy. I took the precaution of dispatching a nigger with a note to Mafeking, telling Colonel Baden-Powell of my plan, and that, having heard a Dutch woman called Mrs. Delport in Mafeking wished to join her friends in the Transvaal, I intended asking General Snyman to exchange me for her. The distance we had to drive was 45 miles, along villainous sandy roads and under a burning African sun. We outspanned for the second time at the house of De Coker, who had been the first to advise me to visit the LAAGER. His dwelling was situated close to the railway line, or rather to where the railway line had been. Here there was a great stir and bustle. Men were hurrying in and out, nearly all armed. Horses were tethered before the door, and on hearing my cart drive up, the Veldkornet himself came out to meet me and gravely invited me to descend. I now saw the interior of a typical Dutch house with the family at home. The vrouw came forward with hand outstretched in the awkward Boer fashion. The Dutch do not shake hands, they simply extend a wooden member which you clasp, and the greeting is over. I had to go through this performance in perfect silence with about 7 or 8 children of various ages, a grown-up daughter, and 8 or 10 men, most of whom followed us into the poky little room which appeared to serve as a living room for the whole family. Although past 10 o'clock, the remains of breakfast were still on the table, and were not appetizing to look at. We sat down on chairs placed in a circle, the whole party commencing to chatter volubly, and scarcely a word being intelligible to me. Presently the vrouw brought me a cup of coffee in a cracked cup and saucer. Not wishing to give offence, I tried to swallow it. The coffee was not bad if one could only have dissociated it from that dreadful breakfast table. I then produced some cigarettes and offered them to the male element. They were enchanted, laid aside their pipes and conversed with more animation than ever. But it was only occasionally that I caught a word I could understand. The sentence, "Twee tozen engelman dude, 32, recurred with distressing frequency, and enabled me to grasp their conversation was entirely about the war. I meanwhile studied the room and its furniture, which was of the poorest description. The chairs mostly lacked legs or backs, and the floor was of mud, which perhaps was just as well, as they all spat on it in the intervals of talk, and emptied onto it the remains of whatever they were drinking. After a short time a black girl came in with a basin of water, with which she proceeded to plentifully sprinkle the floor, utterly disregarding our dresses and feet. Seeing all the women tuck their feet under their knees, I followed their example until this improvised water cart had finished its work. The grown-up daughter had a baby in her arms, as uncared for as the other children, all of whom looked as if soap and water never came their way. The men were fine, strong-looking individuals, and all were very affable to me, or meant to be so if I could but have understood them. Finally 4 or 5 more women came into this tiny overcrowded room, evidently visitors. This was the finishing stroke, and I decided that, rested or not, the mules must be inspanned, that I might leave this depressing house. One of the young burghers brought me the pass to General Snyman, the calligraphy of which he was evidently very proud of, and having taken leave of all the ladies and men in the same peculiar stiff manner as that in which I had greeted them, I drove off, devoutly thankful to be so far on my journey. About 4 in the afternoon we came to a rise, and looking over it, saw the white roofs of Mafeking lying about 5 miles away in the glaring sunlight. Then we arrived at the spot where General Cronje's LAAGER had been before he trekked south, marked by the grass being worn away for nearly a square mile, by broken-down wagons, and by sundry aasvogels, the scavengers of South Africa, hovering over carcasses of horses or cattle. Mafeking was now only 3 miles distant, and seeing not a solitary soul on the flat grass plains, I felt very much tempted to drive into the native stat. But the black boys resolutely declined to attempt it, as they feared being shot, and they assured me that many Boer sharpshooters lay hidden in the scrub. Thinking discretion the better part of valour, I regretfully turned away from Mafeking by the road leading up an incline to the LAAGER, still several miles distant. The cart was suddenly brought to a standstill by almost driving into a Boer outpost, crouched under a ruined wall, from which point of vantage they were firing with their rifles at the advanced trenches of the town. The officer in charge of this party told me I must stay here till sundown, when he and his men would accompany me to headquarters, as he averred the road I was now pursuing was not safe from the Mafeking gun range. I therefore waited their good pleasure for an hour, during which time the firing from all round the town went on in a desultory sort of way, occasionally followed by a boom from a large bore gun, and the short, sharp, hammering noise from the enemy's 1-pounder Maxim. The sun was almost down when the burgher in charge gave the signal to bring up their horses, and in a few minutes we were under way. This time I was attended by a bodyguard of about 18 or 20 burghers, and we went along, much to my annoyance, at a funereal pace. On our way we met the relieving guard coming out to take the place just evacuated by my escort. When seen riding thus more or less in ranks, a Boer squadron, composed of picked men for outpost duty, presented really a formidable appearance. The men were mostly of middle age, all with the inevitable grizzly beard, and their rifles, gripped familiarly, were resting on the saddlebow. Nearly all had 2 bandoliers apiece, which gave them the appearance of being armed to the teeth. A more determined-looking band cannot be imagined. The horses of these burghers were well bred and in good condition, and although their clothes were threadbare, they seemed cheerful enough, smoking their pipes and cracking their jokes. When we at last drew up at headquarters, I was fairly startled to find what an excitement my appearance created, about 200 or 300 Boers swarming up from all over the LAAGER and surrounding the cart. The general was then accommodated in a deserted farmhouse, and from this building at last issued his secretary, a gentleman who spoke English perfectly, and to whom I handed my letter requesting an interview. After an interminable wait among the gaping crowd, the aforementioned gentleman returned, and informed me I could see the general at once. He literally had to make a way for me from the cart to the house, but I must admit the burghers were very civil, nearly all of them taking off their hats as I passed through them. Once inside the house, I found myself in a low, dark room, and in the farthest corner, seated on a bench, were 2 old gentlemen, with extra long beards, who were introduced to me as General Snyman and Commandant Boer, 33. I was at once struck by the anything but affable expression of their countenances. They motioned to me to take a chair. Someone handed me a bowl with a brown mixture, presumably coffee, which I found very embarrassing to hold during our conversation. This was carried on through the secretary, and the general got more and more out of temper as he discovered what my request was. I informed him I had come at the suggestion of his Veldkornet, that all my relations were in England except my husband, who was in Mafeking, that there was no meal in the colony where I had been living, and that I was prepared to ask Colonel Baden-Powell to exchange me for a Dutch lady whom I heard wished to leave, if he, General Snyman, would accept the exchange. He promptly, and with much decision, refused. Then it occurred to me this old gentleman meant to keep me as a prisoner of war, and my heart sank into my shoes. The only concession I could obtain was that he would consider my case, and in the meantime he ordered that I should be accommodated in the field hospital. Accompanied by the secretary, and leaving the staring crowd behind, I drove off to a little house about half a mile away, where we found our destination. I was shown into a tiny room, smelling strongly of disinfectants, which from the large centre table I at once recognized as the operating room, and here I was told I could sleep. I was too tired to care much. There was no bed, only a broken-down sofa, and in the corner a dilapidated washstand. The walls and windows were riddled with bullets, denoting where the young burghers had been amusing themselves with rifle practice. The secretary then informed me that they had to search my luggage, which operation lasted fully half an hour, although I had but one small portmanteau and a dressing case. The latter two Dutch nurses were told off to look through, which I am bound to say, they did most unwillingly, remarking to me they had not contemplated searching people's luggage as part of their already onerous duties. I had even to undress, in order that they might reassure the officials I had no documents on my person. Meanwhile the men examined my correspondence and papers almost microscopically. Needless to say, they found nothing. They had barely finished their researches when a messenger came from the general to say, if Colonel Baden-Powell would exchange me for a Dutchman imprisoned in Mafeking, a certain Petrus Viljoen, he would consent to my going in. I found, on inquiry, that,